Shalom WJC family. It's time for our weekly Torah talk. This week in Shul we read Parshat Terumah, a big shift in the book of Exodus from the narrative of the escape from Egypt and the revelation at Sinai. Now we downshift into many chapters of instructions on how to build a tabernacle. The whole question of why we have this tabernacle and what it's supposed to accomplish, so much that it takes up 7 or 8 chapters at the end of the book of Exodus, interrupted just briefly in Kitisa by the narrative of the golden calf, is a real question. Why does God want a house? It says, Vasuli mikdash, v'shachanti betocham, make me a mikdash, like it says on the outside of WJC, right? Make me a sacred space that I may dwell among them. A lot of questions raised by the tabernacle itself. Today I want to focus in on one very obvious seeming contradiction in the construction, and one that many of you are familiar with. Right? In the heart of the tabernacle, in a place called the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies, there is to be placed an aron, an ark. And on that ark, on the cover, known as the kaporet, the lid of the ark, are to be placed 2 figures of cherubim, of cherubim, facing each other, made out of one piece of gold, so somehow touching, and kind of with their gaze downward. Presumably because we're going to hear later that God's going to speak to Moses from the top, the space between the cherubim above the ark, and so the cherubim have their gaze downward as not to gaze upon, the presence of God. Here's the problem. You're probably familiar with this, right? From famous depictions like the Raiders of the Lost Ark and others of this Ark of the Covenant. It's a very famous vessel in which will be placed later the broken tablets of the Decalogue, of the 10 Commandments. The question is, in those very 10 Commandments, right, this revelation that just happened at Sinai, God gave very careful instructions about making statues of things. You're not supposed to do it, right? Thou shalt make no graven images. So how can it be that in the 10 Commandments it says make no graven images, and now here in the heart of the tabernacle itself, you're supposed to have a pair of graven images of angels? What is the text trying to show us? What is it trying to say? And many commentators ask this question. They come up with varying explanations. So Chizkuni first asks this question. He says, why is this different? He says, well, there's 2 of them rather than 1 of them, so you shouldn't think this is one God. They're serving another purpose. He says these are not the prohibition against making a graven image is a prohibition against making physical beings, creatures that you would see in the world, and these cherubim are not. They're at another plane of existence. And Rabbeinu Bachya comes in and gives a very interesting explanation, one that I like a lot, which is that he says this is to show us that angels exist, which may shock you a little. Usually in our Jewish practice, we don't think of angels so much existing in this way, although the Bible talks a lot about them, about cherubim in particular being in the presence of God. So why is it important that we recognize angels exist? Because through angels, that is how God, it's a recognition that God can manifest God's power in the world, right? Angels are divine creatures that have a purpose. The purpose of angels in Jewish lore is that these are how God emanates God's self into the world. They come and they have a job, whether that was to give revelation to the patriarchs and matriarchs, or whether it is to protect certain nations. There's all different kinds of angels, but these angels, these cherubim, are to remind us that God acts in the world. By the way, that also affects us when we say we are little less than angels, or at least human beings have the potential to be little less than angels. We're saying we also have a role to play of being workers for God in the world. And that's some of the backbone of Judaism and Jewish practice, is to be emissaries for God's holiness in the world, little less than angels, at least when we're at our best. So maybe these kruvim are in the center of the Beit HaMikdash, out of sight, right? Nobody's going to see these graven images, so they're protected. But they represent to everyone that God isn't just this idea out there somewhere. Remember, this is a radical idea, the idea of the Jewish God. The world was full of idol worshippers, a God you can't see, a God you can't bow down to a statue of. Now we take for granted, after thousands of years of monotheism, the idea of a God that you can't see. But at this time it was radical. And so you might have thought this God that has no form, is distant, is not interacting with the world. And the kruvim say, no, God is interacting with the world, and you can sense God in the world. The tabernacle itself and this aron and these kruvim perhaps serve another purpose. Once recognizing God is in the world, there is a tendency to be very passionate about God in the world, doing God's purpose. We have all seen people filled with religious fervor, and often those people do some of the best work in the world to make the world better, to care for others. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. That passion can be channeled into ways that start out all I'm working for God, right? But the passion goes astray, and in fact, great calamitous evil can enter the world in the name of religion. As a matter of fact, that may be why the golden calf narrative is stuck in the middle of all these chapters about the tabernacle. We have the tabernacle, instructions of how it's to be built, then the golden calf narrative, and then the creation of the tabernacle, almost exactly repeated according to what we're going to start reading today. So the question is, right, why would you stick this narrative right in the middle? Maybe the Torah is trying to tell us in its construction, the golden calf, this is when your passions get out of hand without guidance, without structure. The tabernacle is a way to protect against that, to give structure. And so much of Judaism and Jewish life is to put structure around our religious passion. But first you have to have the religious passion. So this is a two-part instructions that we get from Parshat Terumah. One, be passionate about God. Recognize through the kruvim that God is active in the world. Recognize the miracles that are all around us. When you look around you, you see how this world functions, the existence of love, the way we interact with each other, the existence of beauty, the grace with which so many of us live. And say, God is active in this world. There are kruvim, there are God's emissaries, metaphorically or literal, however you want to think of them, but God is active in the world, and boy, I want to be part of that. I want to be passionate for God. But then to also recognize that needs to be controlled, right? Passion can go astray. We don't want to be worshiping golden calves. We want to be interacting with the one true God. And to do that, we need parameters. We need mitzvot. We need instructions and structure to make sure that we are channeling our passion for good, by bringing goodness into the world, by doing God's work in the world, just like those kruvim. And maybe that's the most important message of the kruvim. I've been reading this year, Dr. Leon Kass came out with a commentary on Exodus. It's entitled Founding God's Nation. I've been reading it, so you'll probably hear a lot about it over the next few weeks. And he makes a spectacular point, which is the last time we heard about kruvim, or at least the first time we heard about a cherub in the Torah, was at the incidents of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Right, Adam and Eve eat the apple, and their punishment is to be exiled from the garden. And there's an angel there called a cherub, a kruv, who stands with a fiery sword, right, blocking the path back to the tree of life. Right? So these kruvim, they remind us of the first time our passion got ahead of us, right? Adam and Eve, they wanted knowledge. They wanted to be godlike. And imitating God, being godlike, is something we pursue, to walk in God's ways. But of course, to confuse that with being God, with having the same wisdom of God, that is the wrong way. So God told them, don't eat from this, and they broke it. They went with their passion outside of the structure God tried to give them. Now, here in the tabernacle, we see again kruvim atop the Aron HaKodesh, not with fiery swords, but in God's sanctuary, giving perhaps access back to God. And as Dr. Cass puts it, might the likenesses of the kruvim in this story and on the kaporet, on the lid of the ark, signal the possibility of atonement and a return to living with the Lord? Could the ark and its contents be, for the people, the true tree of life? And hence the name kaporet for that cover, which could be related to the word atonement, like Yom Kippur. How is the lid and these kruvim kaporet, atonement? Maybe it's the ultimate atonement for the beginning of humankind, when we let our passion get ahead of us. And now we can access that divine wisdom. We can live our lives walking in God's ways by following the mitzvot, by following the law that will ultimately be placed in the ark, ultimately be placed in our hands. And we can channel our passion for God. Find your passion and channel it into mitzvot, into doing the things that God has told us are good. When that is done, that passion can be a great gift. In a time when we have seen religious passion taken in all different directions, often violent, often corrupt, often being used by powerful people to get more power and authority, it is good to remember that passion for God is not a bad thing. But as we learn in Terumah, as we learn from the tabernacle, that passion needs to be channeled and structured in the way that God gives us in the great gift of the tabernacle and the Aron that we read about this week in Shul. Wish you a Shabbat Shalom. I hope that you are able to connect with your passion and that ultimately together we're able to do great holy work in the world.